There's one thing anyone suffering from an anxiety disorder really knows too well. Being constantly aware of every little reaction in your body, no matter how small, with the fear of fear, so to speak, dominating and overwhelming your routine, your everyday life. And perhaps you've already undergone a whole array of tests and checkups without being able to find any physical or bodily causes for this sudden emerge or outburst of your fears. In such cases, the only diagnosis you get is you've had a panic attack, a panic disorder, agoraphobia, or a generalized anxiety disorder. For many people, it's really difficult to imagine that such severe physical reactions can be triggered off by our mind alone. And on top of that, in your efforts to find a suitable practice or therapist, you may well find that most of the therapies available can be extremely time-consuming, and you have to wait ages just to get a therapy place. And then, when you do finally get a treatment or talk to others suffering from fear, you soon realize there's a frighteningly high number of sufferers who can only be helped on a short-term basis, or maybe not even at all. Now, the reason for this is because of latest scientific advances, most of the therapeutic methods currently being used with anxiety patients have become outdated to a large extent. And several of the methods available, such as psychoanalysis, group therapy, or even confrontation therapy, can end up causing more damage than help at times. So afterwards, patients might feel even worse than they did before the treatment and are no longer able to master the simplest everyday task, like shopping or driving a car. Such therapy treatments can often last for 50 sessions or more. And still, the most basic questions remain unanswered. Questions such as, why do panic attacks happen when I'm calm and relaxed, but almost never when I'm under stress? Or even the question, where does that horrible tingling sensation in my arms and legs come from? Of course, many patients are told that their symptoms are psychosomatic in nature, yet for that, they never get a proper explanation of what psychosomatic really means. But in fact, it's really important to know and understand which neurobiological mechanisms are at work here. Because this helps you realize that all of those nasty physical symptoms really are not as threatening as they seem. Understanding these neurobiological mechanisms, and therefore the cause of panic attacks, is one of the few ways at all for anxiety patients to be able to select the right treatment for themselves from all of the therapeutic options available and find their way back to a healthy and happy life quickly. This podcast will give you answers to all these questions, and that without lots of medical jargon. The first vital aspect is that you understand and realize what has been happening inside you, both physically and mentally, up to now, and why certain forms of therapy simply just won't work with you. This knowledge forms the basis for a new kind of therapy that really is able to release you from your fears and anxieties, quickly, effectively, and over long term. Before I became a therapist, I spent almost 20 years working as a journalist, specializing in medicine and other scientific fields. And at that time, a regular part of my work was covering the latest medical and therapeutic findings and discoveries. On my shoots across Europe and the USA, I got to know many outstanding scientists, medical doctors and therapists, and I was able to experience with my own eyes how quickly you can overcome panic attacks and even other anxiety disorders, once you have the right methods. Modern brain research especially has made major contributions here, and we now have forms of treatment able to provide effective help, and that after just a few sessions. Now, there are many reasons why so few of these therapies have been used to date, and I'll go into that in more detail later on in the podcast. But for you, the important thing for now is that you know that these methods exist, which also means for you in turn that there are now ways and methods to finally become healthy again. In the USA, there are officially more than 40 million anxiety patients, but it is believed that the actual numbers affected there may be as high as 70 to 80 million. And for most of these sufferers, the only treatment they get is some form of sedation with antidepressants. In my view, it is completely incomprehensible why the prescribing of such medication still remains the first option in the treatment of anxiety disorders, And that even though several studies have confirmed that antidepressants only have a positive effect at all on about 25% of patients, with 75% of the people being treated with them getting no improvement whatsoever from them. But for that, quite a number of undesirable side effects. And achieving a progressive change in this situation so that more and more sufferers learn what is really happening in their brains and which treatment options, apart from the outdated standard therapies, are available to put an end to their state of anxiety and panic. Now, this is the aim and purpose of this podcast. Anxiety in general, and that includes panic attacks, is first and foremost our bodies reacting in a perfectly healthy and appropriate way to some danger. This is because fear has only one job: to protect us. For example, if a hungry lion were to leap out of the bush right in front of you, your body would start to produce adrenaline immediately. Your heart rate would go through the roof, and you'd decide within milliseconds whether you're willing to stay and fight, ill-advised perhaps with a lion eyeing you up for lunch, or flee. This is a completely normal and necessary reaction, one that ensures our very survival. But what happens when there is no lion waiting to pounce on you? When your heart starts to race for what seems like no reason at all? When you feel like you're losing control or even go crazy? And when, for no apparent reason, you suffer from symptoms such as dizziness, numbness, shortness of breath, or nausea? And what's going on in your brain in a situation like that? Well, there are 4 fundamental causes or reasons for this, and I'm going to devote a separate podcast episode to each of these causes, so I can explain to you exactly what happens psychodynamically in your brain in these situations, and what you can do in order to put a quick stop to a fast approaching panic attack. In this episode, I'd first like to give you a general overview of the situation, and then go through the various triggers. And who knows? Perhaps you'll even recognize one or more of the triggers within yourself. So let's start with the one cause that I've seen and observed so often in my practice. The number 1 cause is ignored or disregarded warning signals. Before you had your own first panic attacks, you would have had certain warning signals that you either overlooked or even ignored deliberately. Meaning that, on a neuronal basis, you were actually preparing for these first panic attacks, without even realizing it. In episode 2 of our podcast series, I'll explore in detail what these warning signals are and how they emerge. Cause number 2 are certain substances that are capable of triggering off fear and panic. These include drugs especially, as well as certain medicaments, but also several foodstuffs that seem completely harmless. When it comes to drugs, these consist especially of the psychoactive THC, but also MDMA, which includes ecstasy, as well as cocaine and mushrooms, so-called magic mushrooms, which have a psychedelic effect that can quickly lead to panic attacks. And it doesn't make any difference here whether you are consuming these drugs for the first time or already have many years of experience with them. Every single time, you are re-exposing yourself to the risk that your brain is no longer going to do what you'd like. The medicaments include neuroleptics especially, as well as certain thyroid hormones capable of causing panic attacks. And with the thyroid hormones, a change in the medication can really work miracles here, which we'll deal with in our 4th podcast. Cause number 3 is persistently negative thinking, which, by the way, also includes so-called calculated pessimism. Because the way and manner of how we think networks your brain anew every single time. For instance, brain automations become established that ensure at some point or other that you are no longer steering and controlling your brain. Instead, your brain is controlling you. It's quite possible that you have adopted this way of negative thinking already from your parents, or maybe it results from certain experiences you've made as an adult. Still, neither your parents nor those traumatic experiences are responsible for your panic attacks, even though some psychoanalysts still like to claim just that. I also intend to concentrate on this phenomenon in one of the podcasts because a whole series of new and exciting studies have been released in the meantime that focus on this exact subject. Cause number 4 of an anxiety disorder is so-called secondary gain. What we mean by this is that while the affected person is indeed suffering from their anxiety disorder, at the same time they may also have some hidden benefits from it that they themselves are not even aware of often. For instance, you may find that your partner is behaving in a more considerate and attentive way since you started suffering from an anxiety disorder. Or the illness serves you as a legitimate excuse for not taking care of some work that you haven't enjoyed doing for a long time. This may seem inconceivable to you right now, but it is something I experience in my practice on a regular basis. Panic attacks simply disappear from one day to the next just because the person affected has finally plucked up the courage to look for a new, better job, for instance. And with this illness, there are many ways to have such a secondary gain. Later on, when we're dealing with the subject of secondary gains in a separate podcast episode, I'll tell you about an especially gripping case study. But in my opinion at least, a good therapist should recognize the situation at a relatively early stage, and they should be able to provide support when it comes to implementing the decisive changes in your life step by step, so that your mind doesn't have to use an illness anymore in order to avoid an undesirable situation. Well, that was a quick run through the 4 most frequent causes of panic attacks, and it also brings us to the end of the first episode in our podcast series. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be delighted to have you with us again for the next episode. It explores and examines the warning signals that we may be suppressing either consciously or unconsciously, and from which panic attacks can ultimately develop. And if you're interested, you can also find further information on this whole subject on my website, the-anxiety-cure.com. May I wish you well and hope to have you back with us again soon. Your Klaus Bernhard.